In this video, I'll show you how to create dynamic 3D kinetic typography like this in After Effects. Hi, I'm Adam Bennett, this is the Video Shop. While this is a tutorial, I won't be recreating this whole animation step by step. Instead, I'll show you how you can create something similar for your own projects. We'll look at working with 3D type, different techniques for camera moves, and stitching multiple comps together seamlessly. There's a free project file if you want to follow along. If you care about fun kinetic type, let's get started.
I don't care!
This is the finished comp, and as you can see, I've added like a grungy half-tone look to it. We'll come back to this later on, but the bulk of the work is in this composition here, where I brought together a few comps with the refrain. Yeah, it's the refrain. We care a lot. And then the verses. We'll look at this in a little bit more detail later, but I put an adjustment layer on with like a bit of blur. Let's just get into it. We'll create a new composition. I'm going to use Cinema 4D renderer, but Advanced 3D is fine as well, just as long as you can extrude the type. I've got 20 seconds duration. I'm using frame rate 24, or whatever frame rate you want to use is fine. First off, we'll create a new text layer. Okay. And I'm going to bump up the size of this to 300, all caps. So this is Montserrat Black, which is a free Google font, which could work for this sort of look or vibe. Vibe's pretty important when you're doing kinetic type. That's going to dictate which typeface you use. But I'm going to use Futura Extra Black. To make it 3D with an extrusion, we're going to make it a 3D layer. I'm going to change the color. I've got a hex value and then add a stroke, but you're not going to see any stroke with this renderer. Don't know why that's set to 71, but it's 10. Actually, it doesn't matter. So we need to do the stroke here. So go into geometry options and we'll extrude it. And let's say 140. I'm just going to switch to custom view just so we can see what's going on. The extrusion color is going to be the same as the face color, but what we can do is add a text animator, but we're not animating anything. We want a side color RGB. I'm going to call this look, and then I'm going to add a back color as well. Yep. To have a stroke on the face, what we want to do is go into the bevel style. We'll set it to be convex, and then we'll bump this up to 8. So you can see now it's got a stroke. So this value here doesn't make any difference. Okay, I'm going to switch back to active camera, and I'll fill out the scene with the rest of the type, but I won't bore you with that. So now we'll get a camera in here. So this preset 15mm is really wide. May not be for everyone, but what you could do is pop 2 cameras in. So maybe you've got this one, which is a wide, and then another one with sort of more of a standard preset, and you can see immediately the effect there. But it's going to be more pronounced when you are getting close to the text. What we'll do next, and I'll time up this part, is just rotate the text and move it around a little bit. Switch to 2 views here to make that easier, just so it's not flat on facing the camera, so you've got a little bit of perspective. Then once you've jumbled them about a little bit so they look a little bit more interesting, we can get a light in here. And we'll keep this ambient light. We'll probably drop the intensity, but then also a spotlight. And I'll just leave those settings. Yeah, we'll drop the opacity of the ambient light. And again, this is just optional, but just if you wanted to give the look a little bit of a texture with some subtle shadows. Equally, if you don't want to faff around with spotlights, you can switch to Advanced 3D Renderer and then use an HDRI as an environment light. So next, on to actually animating the type. So this is my personal preference, but what I quite like to do for this sort of thing is have a null and make it a 3D layer, and then kind of make sure it's sitting in the middle of the text. So if I make this the top view, so it's kind of in the middle of that jumble. Just call it cam null. This is just me being anal. Again, I'm going to parent both the cameras to that. And then we can just easily rotate around the type. Also, I'm going to switch to the wide view. So that's the good thing about having two cameras parented to the same null. You can switch between them, just compare the views. So obviously, you're getting a lot more exaggerated perspective with the wide camera here. Talking of wide angle lenses and like forced or extreme perspective, it's only fair to credit a couple of the pieces which were an influence on this. One of them is this here that was posted on Reddit. I'll come back to this, and the other one was something a student spotted recently, and I kind of wanted to recreate it, but sort of like a different track. This is Eminem, and I have not paid for the use of it, so you'll just have to watch it on mute. I'll come back to this a bit later, but this one here, the energy and the vibe of this is really, really nice. This is Hans Bobby. He sort of posted like how he did this with text animators, and it's kind of a work of genius. Definitely check out his website and his YouTube channel. The angles and the perspective on the type and the kind of look was one influence, and then this sort of style of the text coming on and the kinetic camera work was another influence. But now that we've got this setup here with a camera and a null and some type, what I did with my animation during the process was just experiment with different looks, duplicate the comps, and just try out different angles, move the text around, just sort of see what looks interesting. Some of these I ditched and I didn't develop any further, and some of them ended up in the final animation, such as this. That's a process that you'll want to go through. So as you can see, I'm doing that here, just trying to find some interesting sort of dynamic angles. So the next thing I'd suggest doing before you start animating, as well as getting some interesting looks for the type, is to get a guide comp for the lyrics of your song. It didn't work for this song, but what you could try doing is bringing it into Premiere, then using the text panel and try create captions from transcript and just see what happens. So what I got, hilariously, bears very little resemblance to the actual lyrics. These are the lyrics here. The Gareth Bale can't play fake. Depending on your track, what you might need to do is do it manually. So what I did was I called it a sketch comp. One thing I did, because it's quite a bombastic track, was to sort of mark the beats. I don't know beats to the bar, or I have no music vocabulary. I have very little motion design vocabulary, but it basically just involved selecting this null, and if I delete all the markers, just as it's playing, sort of hitting those beats with the asterisk key or the number keypad to mark the beats, and that resulted in this. Then just doing guide text, obviously just animating the source text, just so you've got a very rough guide for when you do the sort of final comps. So I also tried using AI to create an SRT file that I could import into After Effects or Premiere to time the text to. So I tried Sonics.ai and AmberScript, and the results were a little bit better than this, but not much. But again, it's going to depend on what you're animating and the song that you're using. So let's animate one of the verses. So if we duplicate one of these, and I'm going to call this verse 1. And I'll just turn off the lights for now. And then if you've got a sketch comp, you can bring it in, use the audio and the text. So if we make this about, and I'll just skip ahead here to where we've got text for that verse in here. So I used a few different techniques for animating the camera. So one was animating the position of the camera null. So let's say we want it to be on about first of all, and I'll use, this is where using the sketch guide is handy. So about, so set a keyframe there, and then maybe for, don't need to hang on the, it's not particularly important. So army, so another keyframe. So, and what I might do is just pop that over here in the corner. So I'll just skip ahead here while I adjust the position of that null. Then we're ready to start animating the type. And the simplest way would be just to have these coming on in time to the music. But you can also add, as I've done, text animators into the mix. Yeah, I'm not going to go through that step by step because you can take a look at this tutorial or this one, and that'll give you a good idea. Well, you'll know exactly how to add text animators after that. So what we'll do is we'll just time this to come on sort of roughly with the track. And I mean, this is super sketchy. Let's just preview it. Okay, so that's hilariously unimpressive, but if we add maybe some rotation on the camera null, and you can either animate the X, Y, and Z rotations, or if you just want, if you want fewer keyframes, you could do the orientation. Again, I'll just skip ahead so that we've got both sets of keyframes now. So next what I'm going to do is add an expression onto the position, and this is one that I use a lot. So it's this inertial bounce from Harry J. Frank.
Thank you, Harry.
So it's not going to work on the orientation, but we'll just apply it to the position, and let's just look at the difference there. Okay, so that's still super lethargic, but that expression can be really handy for creating overshoot on the camera moves. So what I've done here with one of the refrains, is applied that expression to the X, Y, and Z rotation. So I've got the key points that I want the camera to hit on each word. And that just gives us some easy sort of bounce and overshoot. But if we just jump ahead a little bit so that we've got this type in, so about the Army, Navy, Air Force, and I've set 4 keyframes on the position with that bouncing inertial bounce expression. And with the orientation, I've just easy used the keyframes to make it a little bit smoother. And so there's still problems. We can refine it, but it's starting to feel a bit more kinetic. This is one approach of moving the camera around, is linear keyframes, you know, getting this sort of zigzagging approach. Another approach you might want to try is, what I'll do is duplicate the verse 1, and we'll call this roving keyframes. Okay, and then I'll set it to 2 views. So with this approach, I'm going to get rid of the expression. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you, Harry.
And the camera, what I'll do is pull in, I'll pull in the camera and type from yeah, here. So verse 2, Let's actually first to Rove in, just to show you. So I'm going to do this roughly, but I'm just going to pull the camera back through this type. And then go to 2 views. And then here, so if I move the camera to the left and then maybe here, depending on where the type is, we can right click on these keyframes and rove across time. And also, to make the camera move smoother, go to the Convert Vertex tool and pull these handles. So, and again, it's going to depend where your type is, but you can also move it sort of up and down as well. So now that we've got these keyframes, so you see, as we move it sort of further down, these roving keyframes are shifting along in the timeline. So it's going to be a constant speed between these 2 keyframes, the first and end keyframe. So this isn't going to work for the type that I've got here necessarily, because I'd need to sort of move the type around or whatever. But you can also Control-Alt-O to set the orientation, and if you didn't want to rotate the camera, you could orient it along the path. What it does is it tends to sort of flip it in the opposite direction, so you can just go to rotation and we'll set the orientation to be, so I think 180 and 180, so there we go. But now you can see the camera sort of moving. Obviously it's losing the text, but one thing you could do is, so let's say you had some, like this about type. So that's pretty much in frame. We can move it. Now I'm going to duplicate it and then parent it to the camera and then just move along, and you can see it's kind of sticking to the camera, so the perspective is the same. And then, so maybe the next bit of type, so NY, I'll have that come on, trim that, unparent it from the camera. The way I describe this to students is, and in a really bad way, think of it as like a bus, and you're sort of hopping on the bus and then you're getting off at the next stop or whatever, and then the bus sort of carries on, so the camera is the bus. I told you it's a terrible analogy. So this would be, let's say, and obviously you change the color. I'm just doing this quickly. And then the next one is like NY. But then we'll parent it again. So then you've got sort of like a swooping, the camera sort of swooping about, and you're not having to manually place the type in front of it. You're just parenting it to the camera and then dropping it off. And doing something like that, you'll get broadly an effect like this. So you can see the camera sort of moving sort of up and down, and then I've got the orientation along the path here. And as I said before, I've added text animators into the mix, so the type's coming on, but it could just as easily be that the type's just there and the camera's pulling back and it's sort of finding the words. And that gives us this part of the animation here. So that's another approach for animated cameras. So what I've done here is this is a bit messy, but I've got 4 spotlights, an ambient light, and then what I've done is I've put a solid in the background here where the shadows are being cast onto. So the lights are here, and it's a bit of a messy setup, but just makes it look a little bit more interesting with the sort of shadows being cast behind the type. Let's just take a look at the comps that I've used to make this animation one by one. So for this first one here, I've got the type laid out sort of 360 and it's static, and then I've got the camera is parented to a null that's in the center, and that's rotating on the X. So you can see the camera up here is just rotating around that null. 3 spotlights, and then we're just pushing into this type with the Z position. So that's pretty straightforward. Then this verse here, I'll turn off the lights and the background. So we've got the roving camera, and then just animating the Z rotation a little bit. And this null makes it easier to do the movement match cuts in the final comp. So if we go back to the final thing, just to help link the different compositions, you've got the sort of fast movement into the text, and then you want to carry that through to the next comp. So the main movement is done with the camera wandering around and finding the type, but then the null here, I've just animated the Z position and then easy eased it. So you're sort of doing this sort of fast push in, and then when we get to here, it's moving down. And this is probably, as someone pointed out on Reddit, the Marines type here probably could be more legible. In fact, there's a lot here that could be done better. But one thing you need to bear in mind is with these sort of like lyric videos, you don't need to see the type for very long to register it, because you're listening to it as well. So it can be quite quick, but the movement going all the way down here is a match cut, or leads to a match cut. For the next refrain, I'm going to keep on using refrain because I had to look that up. So not the chorus, but refrain. Anyway, I've got that here as well. So the camera's sort of moving from the top down to find the type. So with this expression, it's pretty easy because they're linear keyframes. So you don't have to worry about smoothing them out or easing them. What this null's doing is kind of punching into the letters with the music. So in its raw form, it looks like that. So kind of super in your face, but that's, as I said before, that's the vibe of the song. So the second verse, the camera's pretty much just pulling back as the type animates in front of it. The little bit of rotation on the null. To link that to the next refrain, just created another null just to rotate round the type and then match the transition into the next refrain. And also just fine tune the position, because I've set a position keyframe here. And I think it was when I was comparing, so on one of the nearly finished renders, I sort of watched it back and I just thought that LAPD, we weren't really sort of focusing on it too much. So rather than go in and tweak the keyframes of the null, it was just easier to create a second null. And what I did was just adjust the position so that we're actually focusing on it more and it's sort of centered in frame. So before, the type was sort of down here. Then at the beginning, I used that null just to line up the camera to the center of the O. So we're pulling back through that for the beginning of this transition. That's just my way of working. So sometimes I'll have a null where I'm doing the main keyframing on, and then I might just have one null to fine tune it and then add, match cut rotation keyframes or whatever. So that's these. And yeah, we're nearly there with the sort of basic 3D look. So this one just got the type kind of rotating, spinning in, just kind of nicely eased, absolutely no consistency to the way everything animates on. It's just for fun. And then the movement on this is kind of hard to see from this angle, but it's sort of arcing slightly as it moves round, and then the sort of rotation in to match it to the previous verse. So what you might do, which I did, was just try some different techniques. So there's some here that I didn't use, and they're kind of variations. You know, the types. Yeah, it was the bounce was a little bit too cute on that one. This one I quite like, but didn't end up using it. So it's just an early experiment for this verse, which as you can see sort of doesn't quite work. But you might have to try a few things out until you're happy with something. And obviously be prepared to listen to whatever you're working on quite a few times. So make sure you pick something you like, or maybe you should pick something you don't like. Finally, what I did was put this all into one comp. I've got a cheesy vignette around the edges, but that's just because for the grade that I've got, the sort of halftone, grungy halftone effect, it only registers when there's a little bit of vignette to latch onto. The blur was just when the camera's moving, if there's sort of sudden camera moves, I just faked with camera lens blur, because you don't have any depth of field or blur options with the cameras for Cinema 4D or Advanced 3D renderer. So just as the camera's sort of bouncing around, just keyframing the blur radius a bit just to sort of cheat that effect. And then this final scene, I'll just show you the separate layers. So this is the Studio Xenac grunge effect. I've just got that at 80 opacity. And then I think this is Michael Ponch's halftone. Thank you, Michael. And then the main comp, but I've set it to color. And this is kind of quite a hacky approach, but I just sort of tried different layer modes and opacities, and also just to give it a little bit of variation, I've just added a wiggle on a few of these, so the opacity sort of, varying. Not on that one, but I think on this one as well. So I'll just turn that off. But with all of these combined and a bit of photocopy texture as well, and grain on top, that looks super gnarly. But I've just brought just so it's not quite so graded out, I've just brought the original comp back in just slightly. And I guess the whole combination is kind of hacky, but whatever you're working on, you might have a different look to it, depending on the song or poem or whatever it is that you're working on. But I hope that's been useful and at least given you some of the tools that you need to create your own work. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.